52 elk. That was the entire plan. Scientists said give it 15 years before expecting real results. The valley started answering in months. Not in the elk, not in the herd numbers, in the grass, then in the rabbits, then in the hawks, then in something nobody on the monitoring team had written into the projection models. This is Cataloochee Valley in the Great Smoky Mountains. And this is the story of what happens when a landscape gets back the one thing it forgot it needed. Joe Yarkovich could stand in Cataloochee Valley and see what most visitors missed. By the late 1990s, the valley was green, quiet, trees dense along the ridges, grass soft across the open bottoms, wildflowers in spring, mist in autumn. Tourists drove the Blue Ridge Parkway and called it beautiful. From a distance, Cataloochee didn't look broken. It looked like a postcard. But Yarkovich, a wildlife biologist who would spend years tracking the herd, had learned to read a valley differently. A green field is not always a working field. A meadow can be empty in a way that has nothing to do with what's growing in it. The last elk in North Carolina had been killed sometime around 1800. For nearly 2 centuries, the valley had continued without them. The grass had grown. The seasons had turned. Nothing catastrophic had happened, but something underneath the surface had been drifting. Without large grazers moving through the valley floor every day, the open meadows of Cataloochee had slowly begun to close. Not because of logging, not because of farming, because the process that kept them open, heavy animals tearing grass, pressing hooves into soil, moving through in herds, had simply stopped. Shrubs pushed into grassland, grasses tangled and thickened. The clear, open corridors that had existed in the valley for thousands of years began filling in. The mountains didn't look sick, they went quiet. And the animals that depended on open ground went quiet with them. Here is what an elk actually does in a valley. It eats, it walks, it tears grass and moves on. It presses its hooves into wet soil and leaves shallow depressions that fill with water after rain. It rolls. It grazes the same corridor multiple times until the grass stays short. That sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. Rabbits need open pathways through short grass to move and feed safely. Wild turkeys need clear sight lines to spot what's coming. Red-tailed hawks, the ones that hunt from above, need short vegetation to see the ground. A field that's 2 feet tall is a field where a hawk cannot work. For nearly 150 years, Cataloochee had grass. What it didn't have was the animal that knew what to do with it. In 2001, the National Park Service made a decision that took years of politics and veterinary review to reach. 25 elk were brought from land between the lakes in Kentucky and released into Cataloochee Valley. A year later, 27 more arrived, this time from Elk Island National Park in Alberta, Canada. 52 animals, everyone fitted with a radio collar, every movement tracked. Joe Yarkovich's team set up monitoring stations across the valley, and then they did something simple and specific. They built 15 small exclosures, fenced plots, each one 39 square feet, hidden in different parts of Cataloochee. Inside each fence, no elk. Outside, free to graze. Same valley, same soil, same rainfall. 2 different outcomes, running side by side. The difference was visible before the scientists expected it. Where elk foraged, the grass stayed shorter, the plant community shifted. More forb species, less woody encroachment. The uniform tangle of overgrown grass began breaking into a mosaic. Patches of open, cropped ground beside stands of taller vegetation. Edge habitat. The kind that hadn't existed in Cataloochee in over a century. And then the animals started showing up. Rangers walking the valley in the first year reported rabbits in areas where the undergrowth had been too dense to navigate. Wild turkeys were moving through fields that had been nearly impassable. Above the meadows, red-tailed hawks began hunting in patterns that hadn't been seen in living memory. The shortened grass gave them clear sight lines to the ground for the first time in more than 100 years. Nobody had put those animals on a reintroduction plan. Nobody released them. They were already there. They just hadn't had anywhere to go. Now, to be precise about what this was and wasn't, the chain from elk to grass to rabbit to hawk is not a fully proven trophic cascade, not in the strict scientific sense. Yarkovich himself estimated it could take 10 to 15 years to gather enough data to determine the full picture. But the exclosures gave the park something it had never had before: a direct comparison, running at the same time, in the same place, a valley with the missing piece, and a valley without it. The difference was not subtle. Yarkovich spent years watching the part of the story that had the highest chance of falling apart. Early models were not optimistic. Black bears preyed on calves. A 2009 study by Murrow, Clark, and Delosier found that calf recruitment, how many young survived their first year, was the variable that could break the herd's future before it started. The first years were hard. Bear predation was real. Disease was a constant concern. In 2003, planned additional releases were put on hold entirely over fears of chronic wasting disease. But the herd held. By the 2020s, population estimates put the Cataloochee elk at roughly 250 to 260 animals, nearly 5 times the original 52. Female annual survival rates came in above 95%. The herd was not struggling. It was growing faster than the models had predicted. One moment from those years captures something important. A cow elk lost her calves 2 years in a row, both times likely to bears. The third year, she didn't go back to the same place. She changed where she gave birth, moved to a different part of the valley. That calf survived. Nobody told her to do that. The animal had learned its landscape. Here is where the simple version of this story breaks down. Years after the elk came back, after the herd grew, after the hawks returned, after the valley opened, people were still walking into Cataloochee with drip torches and setting fire to it on purpose. In 2025, the National Park Service announced a prescribed burn across approximately 89 acres of the valley. The stated reason: restore native meadow habitats, reduce woody encroachment, maintain the historic open landscape. If the elk were grazing, why burn? Because open meadows in the Smokies don't stay open on their own. Trees move in, shrubs fill the gaps. The same slow process that had been closing Cataloochee before 2001 doesn't stop just because the grazers are back. Elk help. They do not replace fire. They do not replace monitoring. They do not replace the radio collars and GPS units and the biologists checking the data. The return of 52 animals did not make the valley self-running. It made grazing part of the system again. That is not a small thing, but it is not the whole thing. Bill Stiver is a supervisory wildlife biologist for Great Smoky Mountains National Park. His job covers bears, elk, wild hogs, bats. Increasingly, it covers visitors. When the herd grew large enough to be visible from the road, people came. They stopped their cars on the narrow Cataloochee Road. They stepped out with phones, with telephoto lenses. Some walked toward the animals. The rule is 50 yards, roughly half a football field. Close enough to see, far enough to be safe. But wildlife management, as Stiver and his colleagues have said plainly, becomes people management. You track collared elk. You also explain to a family why they cannot walk toward a bull elk during rut. You redirect traffic. You post signs. You issue fines when necessary. The elk came back because of a human decision. They survived because of human monitoring. They now shape the valley because of what they are. But the valley still needs fire. The people still need rules. The victory is real. It is not simple. Autumn in Cataloochee. An elk bull bugles somewhere beyond the tree line. Fog lifts off the grass, hoof prints pressed into wet mud, short grass stretching toward the ridge. Somewhere out of frame, a road. Behind it, visitors keeping their distance. Behind them, a Park Service crew with a burn plan for next spring. For nearly 200 years, Cataloochee had everything an elk needs: grass, water, space, forest cover. What it didn't have was the animal that knew what to do with it. 52 animals came back. The herd grew. The grass changed. The rabbits came back to ground they could move through. The hawks came back to a field they could finally see. None of that was guaranteed. None of it was automatic. It required a decision, a release, 15 years of monitoring, prescribed fire, visitor management, and a cow elk who figured out where it was safe to give birth. But it happened. And on an autumn morning in Cataloochee Valley, a sound echoes off the ridgelines that no one alive had ever heard there before 2001. It's a sound these mountains knew long before we did.